I like this building, but yes, it is a bit on the cool side. But I think everyone obviously is going to agree with me. At least it's not plus 30. I, I know I'm always in the minority for preferring cool weather, but all right. Why don't we open in prayer and then we can get started? Who is willing to volunteer to open up in prayer this morning? Then if no one, oh, Howard's got it.
Dear Lord, I thank you for this day. I thank you that we can gather here. I thank you for all the blessings of different buildings that we are blessed with, that we can use us for your glory. That we can all concentrate here and learn something. I pray for God's teaching next week, that the blessings on us up in your time.
Amen. All right, so we are continuing on in chapter 19, which has to do with the law of God. So if you want to turn to page 40, we're going to look this morning at section 4. So page 40, section 19:4. And it says this: To Israel he also gave various judicial laws which ceased at the same time their nation ended. These laws no longer obligate anyone as part of that institution. Only their general principles of justice continue to have moral value. And so again, in classical theology, and this is not just evangelical and reformed theology, this is classical Christian theology. And I've mentioned again in the past, so this isn't even a point of difference between Protestants and Roman Catholics. Until the 1990s, we all agreed on this. This threefold division of the law. So you have God's moral law, which is a picture of God's character, which of course cannot change. God himself cannot change the moral law. Okay? God himself can't change the moral law. But then God also gave ceremonial laws and civil laws that were unique to the nation of Israel, typological laws. Okay? And those laws, those typological ceremonial laws, like food laws and laws for how the priests were to dress and so forth, those clearly fell away at the establishment of the new covenant. And the category of law which is the trickiest, typically, and kind of the most difficult to kind of suss out the details on, is the civil law. And that's what we're up to today. So Israel had certain civil laws that on the surface don't seem directly like a direct moral law, but they're also not like a food law that clearly the New Testament does away with. They're kind of somewhere in between. And this deals with these laws, judicial laws, laws that the government would enforce. So these aren't church laws and these aren't moral laws. These are laws like on the books of a nation that would get tried in court. And what this is saying here is that because we are not in the Old Covenant, that those laws were unique to Israel, certain applications of these laws, but then it says they no longer obligate anyone as part of that institution, only their general principles of justice continue to have moral value. Okay, this is an updated version of the Baptist Confession. The older language for both the Westminster Confession as well as for the London Baptist Confession uses the language is called general equity. Only the general equity of those laws continue to have moral value. And so basically this is saying that the civil laws that Israel had on the books had a moral principle in and underneath and behind them. Okay, so these are like case law applications of God's moral law. Okay? And as far as we can see the moral principle in those laws, they will look different today, but they still have a teaching value. Okay? Well, what does that entail? What does that mean? I'll go back to a familiar example because we've already used it. there is no parapet, there's no fence around anyone's roof that I've been to from this church. No one has a fence around their roof. And the Old Testament is clear that you need to have a parapet around your roof. Okay, so does that law, as a law, just transfer over into the new covenant? This is just plug and play. You just pull it right over, and it's just woodenly exactly the same in the new covenant as the old. Is that the case? No. Are we all agreed? No, there's no wooden one-to-one carryover? Okay. What is the moral principle underneath that law? If we understand the heart of that law, not just the letter of that law, what's in the heart of the law about a fence on your roof? Love your neighbor. Yeah. Don't commit murder, right? And don't be an accessory to murder. Okay, so that's not a changing principle. So we see the principle in and underneath that practice in Israel. So how might we practice that today? How might we practice that today? Salt your sidewalk. And if you don't, you're just as liable as someone in the Old Testament was for someone being harmed on your property. Okay? And the New Testament does this with a lot of Old Testament laws. Okay? Here's another one. I think actually this might be the text. Why don't we go to it? Who wants to read 1 Corinthians 9, verses 8 and 10? 8 through 10. Yeah, this is exactly that example. 1 Corinthians 9, 8 through 10. Go ahead, Keenan.
Do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher should thresh in hope of sharing in the crop.
Okay, very good. So, on the surface, this seems weird unless we understand the internal logic of the Bible. In the Old Covenant, if your ox is helping you thresh, you don't put a muzzle on his mouth. Okay? Why? Well, because he's doing work for you, so if he puts his head down and he wants to eat some of the grain that he's threshing for you, he should be free to do that. And Paul says, yeah, that's why you should pay your ministers. What? Okay? That's what Paul's talking about here. You should support your ministers. Don't muzzle the ox while he's treading out the grain. Now, none of the farmers here thresh with an ox anymore. Okay? So there's absolutely no way to practice that law as a wooden, one-to-one carryover. But Paul is saying if you understand what's at the heart of that law, that someone who's working for you should be able to receive a benefit from his work. Okay? So don't turn people into slaves. Okay? You understand the general equity, you understand the moral principle in that law. Now once we see the heart behind the law, we find multiple applications in our own settings. And that's exactly, by example, what Paul is doing here. No one has an ox today. Okay? And when God gave Moses this law, he knew that in the year 2020, no one's farming with oxen anymore. But there's a moral principle once we see the heart behind the law that we can apply in our own settings. And I'm going to stop there. Does that make sense? Can you kind of see what's happening here? Or does this seem odd? Am I explaining this okay? Does it make sense? I'm seeing very little body language because we're all cold. Okay. Okay. So how else might we do that? This is saying, in essence, and this is another place of disagreement among Christians today, is, should the laws of a nation reflect biblical law? Yes or no? What's that? Yes. Okay. This is actually super important, so I'm going to ask it again. Should the laws of modern nations reflect biblical law? Yes. Okay? That itself is tremendously controversial today, even among Christians, which is just absolutely bizarre to me. Okay? But the cancer of secularism has embedded itself so deep that even Christians today think in Enlightenment categories. Oh no, we're just going to have, the state is just going to be neutral, and it's just going to call balls and strikes. Okay? And we've all been fed that lie, which is an absolute lie. Because there has to be a standard of what a ball is and what a strike is. Where do we go for that standard? Is it allowed to be arbitrary? Is the state itself allowed to be arbitrary? No. Okay? If there is no law above the state is God. And that's exactly where we live today. Okay? What, no, secularism? Yeah, and we think, well, if Walmart has Hindu Day and then they have Muslim Day, then we're just happy if we get Christian Day put on their calendar too. Okay? Because it's multiculturalism, after all. We're just secular. Okay? But if you're Mr. Walmart, every day is money day, so there's still an overarching principle for why we're doing this. Okay, so we always have to ask this question of by what standard? And every Christian should say by this standard. Okay? Neutrality is a lie. Secularism is an acid that is incredibly corrosive. And grievously, many Christians have fallen for that fable. And then they think when we're in the public square, we have to speak only in kind of these neutral categories, and that's not true. We're Christians. So we see what Christians have believed historically is that there is this general equity principle which persists. Okay? Yeah, so Dave is just pointing out it's a long recovery from where we're at, and which is true, because maybe you've had experience like this, but I've talked to people, because we do live in a highly politicized time. I've talked with people that have no sense of irony whatsoever about what would Jesus do when it comes to immigration, and the fact that Jesus fed 5,000 is obviously clear commands that the state must confiscate the wealth of all those rich, evil people and redistribute it to these poor, innocent people, right? Which is a real stretch. The Bible nowhere teaches socialism. It teaches Christian charity, but that's different than voting for a tax increase on your neighbor so that someone else can get it. That's not biblical ethics at all, okay? Actual charity that comes from me and from you is what's taught in the Bible. So these people, they'll use Jesus as a socialist, but then if you want to use any kind of biblical ethics about, let's say, applying murder laws to the unborn or to the elderly, well, no, you can't have a theocracy. Okay, well, what do you want? Is Jesus allowed to say something about the laws of a nation, or isn't he? Okay? That's the proposal before the House. Does God's will matter for the state of a nation? That's right. Yeah, so Howard's just pointing out the consistency problem. So I'm going to give you a new word that some of you maybe know and some don't. And again, many polite Christian circles, this word has become anathema to many Christians even. But you basically have two principles of law that you can apply to society. You have theonomy or autonomy. Theonomy, you see two words there. Theos is God, and nomos is law. The economy is the law of commerce and of trade and of the household. Theonomy just means God's law. Autonomy means man's law. Okay? If you're an autonomous person, you're just your own person. Okay? No one can tell you what to do. You're autonomous. You're self-regulating. And Howard is correctly pointing out that those are the only two sources of law. Theonomy or autonomy. Those are the only two options. And sometimes people will try to thread the needle, but the problem is they're going to have to get consistent. Okay? So if we're going to do it, let's say with wealth confiscation, which is a grievous principle in the Bible, if we're going to do it there, here's how it might start. We're going to tax people's income. And if you're any Christian from any age, you realize what an ungodly idea this is, that you would tax someone's income. But don't worry, it's only 2%. Okay, so you can all breathe a sigh of relief. So principles are out the window because it's a small amount. And besides, we all know as soon as World War I is over, there's not going to be an income tax anymore. Okay, we all know that. Okay, let's not be so crazy. You know, all those conspiracy theorists who say once you start taxing people's income, it's going to stay on. They're conspiracy theorists. It's off as soon as World War I is over. We just need you to all do your part. Okay, we're in this together. Once we win World War I, that 2% income tax, which is harming people's lives, it's over. Okay, we got consistent, and unfortunately, we got consistent the wrong way. Okay. But ideas keep moving. Ideas don't stop. Ideas have consequences. Okay? And so again, we always have to ask, by what standard? And the Christian should say, by God's standard. Dave.
We also have to look at, even for those of us that would say there should be Christian law, and we would be for law and order, we also have to look at what the Bible says that would look like. Like, even in the case of theft, is it moral that somebody first steals from someone else, then the person who was law-abiding pays for the police, so he's paying for a service again, for them to hopefully find the culprit. Then the culprit goes before a magistrate, who the law-abiding citizen is paying for again. Then the culprit will go to jail, hopefully, which the law-abiding citizen is paying for again. So now the law-abiding citizen has lost his stuff he's stolen from. He's stolen from again by the government. And at the end of the day, yes, this guy got some time taken away, but there's no restitution. So, even just rethinking our whole Enlightenment era of what does justice look like, biblically, that's why I think it's just such a long recovery. Because even amongst Christian circles, they're like, yeah, get tough on crime, build jails. And you're like, oh, great, so our taxes are going to go up again. More theft.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a long way to the top if you want to have just weights and measures, as our poets have said. There was a hand here. I want to pick up that theme a little bit later yet. Yeah, Lisa. I think as Christians, so Lisa's asking about if there's ungodly laws, to what degree, or how do Christians operate when there are ungodly laws? And I think that's not necessarily cut and dried or black and white. That's probably on a sliding scale. Rendering to Caesar what is Caesar's, I think in terms of the most ungodly taxes possible, property tax and inheritance tax are probably the worst. Income tax is probably a little bit less grievous, and consumption taxes make a ton of sense biblically. But to punish a family and to punish the wealth transfer that should happen between generations is grievous. But that's the laws we have. And I am going to do everything I legally can to avoid as much capital gains tax as I can. But I don't see that as worth breaking the law over, so to speak. I will happily say publicly, capital gains tax are wicked. Inheritance tax is more wicked yet, and property tax means that nobody actually owns property. If property tax exists, property ownership does not, because if you don't pay your rent every year to the whichever authority it is, it means it gets taken away from you. Property tax means property ownership is actually impossible. So again, and it sounds radical that we'd say these things because we've all grown up with this, but I think Dave is right. If we get back into the classical world that existed for thousands of years, what we're living in is what's actually radical and extreme and bizarre. Okay, and so this recovery to get back is a long process, and I think there's also a principle here that Christians should not be revolutionaries. Christianity is not revolutionary. It's not a burn it all down, everything needs to be perfect by tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. or else I'm going to light my hair on fire. That's not how Christians work. Okay? Christians work faithfully. We oppose things which are ungodly, and we promote the good, and then we see from the Bible and from experience that sometimes that takes hundreds of years to get lasting reform. And that's how Christians think. And that's how Christians should think. And that's why I've sometimes even mentioned Luther. At his time, as much of a firebrand as Luther was, he was the one telling everybody else, slow down. We're reforming, we're not revolutionizing. Luther himself said, everybody just chill, slower, because we're going to get further and more lasting if we slow it down. If everything has to be perfect by Tuesday, this project is over. And I think as Christians, we need to labor with that long-term kind of generational vision as well. We're not going to just be able to tear it all down and build it perfectly next week. This could take hundreds of years. It took hundreds of years to get here. It could very well take hundreds of years to get to the other side. And then we need that Christian, faithful, generational, long-term thinking. So I think we have to just be okay with we're going to live under certain unjust laws for a period of time, and we do our best to be faithful with that. Now, there may be some laws which are so unjust that we just simply cannot do that. But then I think even there, some people like to make a show of civil disobedience, and some people just quietly go about their business. And I think that's probably the right thing to do. You don't need to call the camera crew if it comes to that. You just quietly, faithfully live your life, and that's that. But I think that the default should be as far as we're able, unless it's like a egregious violation, we have to work with what we're given. Howard.
So when you say not willing, how often are we saying not willing because it's a comfort level rather than the biblical standard that we're standing on? In the United States, it's a little bit more apparent to see some of the lines being drawn because they're actually still talking about abortion rather than our godless country that we live in. And how much easier is it for Christians to agree with laws that say, okay, I would like abortion to be illegal, but definitely no punishment for the mother. Oh, well, that's got to be a Christian value that we go along with. That sounds great. That sounds more peaceful. But that's not biblical, and it's definitely not comfortable. But we're not willing to say it because it's super uncomfortable.
Yep. Yeah, and so Howard's giving the example of abortion. And this is actually a principle I considered while writing the sermon for this week too, is how quickly Christians fold after the fact. Okay? Whether it's liberals never fold. They always know to fight another day. They're thinking in the long game. Christians need a lot of encouragement to think about the long game. And I'm not sure exactly what that is, but Christians tend to think, in my experience, of a one and done. Like if it's not perfect tomorrow, just give your hands up in despair. But how many times do you try to push same-sex marriage and it fails, and then it fails, and then it fails, but they're always back every year with another court case until the Supreme Court caves. And then everyone agrees, okay, well now it's over. This is an untouchable, sacred cow. We can't ever address this ever again because the progressive side won. And we've actually, consciously and unconsciously, we have all been trained in progressivism, which means that the liberalizing forces always win over history, and I think that's a big part of the reason Christians just fold like a cheap tent as soon as godly laws get overturned. Partially, it probably is comfort. It's comfortable to just sit back and say, well, as long as they don't come after my family, I'll just sit here. That could very well be. I think there's sometimes pietism in there, mixed in, right? After you sing "This world is not my home" so and so many times, you start to believe it. And then we start to forget that Jesus says all authority in heaven and, yeah. Why don't we sing "This is my Father's world" a bit more often, right? And then we start to see there's a difference here in thinking. So I think there's a lot of forces that have caused us to withdraw. Comfort, I think short-term thinking, being catechized in the philosophy of Hegel in public school for the last 100 years. There's a lot of unbelieving assumptions, I think, even for a lot of Christians. And progressivism is not inevitable. It was not until 100 years ago, 200 years ago. It's not inevitable. We can say Christianity is inevitable. The Christianizing of the globe is inevitable. You can read about it in Matthew 28. Okay? So I think there's a lot of pieces of our thinking that have to get probably rearranged back to the classical order to see this. Yeah, so Dave is also pointing out that the eschatology evangelicals have embraced could play a factor in here, and I absolutely believe that that is actually an important piece in all this, is as this German philosophy of progress is gaining in power, at the same time, evangelical theologians are crafting in their laboratory a new way to read biblical history, in which the Great Commission is not inevitable, but the disaster and the crisis of the world becomes inevitable. And the hope for the church is not the slow, steady triumph of the gospel through the ages, but is a rapture out of the world while things go to utter chaos. So I think it's fair to say in the last 200 years or so, the Muslims are saying, we win down here. The feminists say, we win down here. The pagans say, we win down here. The Enlightenment philosophers say, we win down here. And Christians start saying, oh, we lose down here. Well, guess what? Everybody got what they were aiming for. Okay, so I do believe a biblical picture of how history works needs to re-enter the picture here too, if we're going to see that long-term generational effort is actually worth it. Okay. Yeah, those are great principles. So Sean had two principles to discuss here. One is, if we take an incremental approach to reform rather than a radical burn it all down approach to revolution, so Luther telling everyone else, slow it down, we need to bring people on board, this is going to take time. If I'm understanding you correct, saying, how does that not turn into complacency? Right? Okay. So how does that not turn into complacency? I've got my own answer, but I think this is a good enough discussion point. I'm going to throw it back here. How do we make sure that that does not become complacency? How could we ensure that? And I think it's actually related to Sean's second point, which is that conservative arguments typically assume the liberal argument, and then we just say, no, we're going to have a more effective approach to the climate emergency. So we're going to take the carbon tax off, and we're still operating on their premises, right? But we're going to do it better, right? Right. So yeah, so the modern conservative approach is, no, our approach to gun crime is going to be better, right, essentially, rather than this maybe isn't an area that the state should be interested in, which is the argument on principle, right? The biblical argument said, no, the state doesn't, God never gave the state authority in this area, so it's not that we're going to do public education better. We're going to hopefully get to the point where we're going to say, God never gave the state that arena to work in, which again, today sounds radical, but in the classical world conception, till recently, that was understood, that was well known. But I think Pete had his hand up here. Yeah, so Pete's, I think, suggesting a very common sense approach, how this doesn't become complacency. And again, it has to do with long-term vision. These are the kids I'm responsible for. I'm not responsible for everyone's kids. Here's the kids God gave me. I'm going to teach them in faith, and we're going to try to send them off as best as we're able in the right direction, right? And changing the world isn't up to any one person, right? The old saying, everyone wants to change the world, but no one wants to change baby's diaper. Well, how do you change the world? Well, one diaper at a time, okay? And you sing Christian songs to that baby, and you teach them the gospel. This is a long-term work. And I think on the complacency question, what we also have to see is you can work faithfully, slowly, and incrementally and patiently if we don't lose our goal of what the end design is, right? We need to just remember where we want to go and not lose focus on the destination. And I'll even shrink that down from the big stage to a local church, okay? And not just a local church, this local church. That people are coming from all different kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of different assumptions. And one of the reasons we're working through confessions and history and different things is to slowly kind of move everyone in the funnel and start seeing these things. If the goal is doctrinal perfection on day one, this would be a wonderful church of 3 people. Okay, that's what a revolutionary, impatient idea does. And once you are committed to instant perfection, that 3-person church eventually becomes 3 churches because we're all so perfectly pure that no one can talk to anyone else. Okay, no disagreement allowed, no patience with people. You got to. Okay, people become cattle at that point. And so I think even when we think of the local church, The goal, and I'm not saying we've done this perfectly, but I think what we want to self-consciously do is you want to move at a brisk walk. If it becomes a race, you leave a whole bunch of people behind. And if you start meandering, you start to forget where we're headed. Okay? A good brisk walk, to me, makes a lot of sense. We're going at a pace that people can more or less keep up, but we're going to keep moving intentionally enough that we're not going to forget about where we're trying to go. And I think that applies to family discipleship, that applies to churches, that applies to workplaces, that applies to commerce, to government. I think we need to keep moving briskly enough that we don't forget what the goal is, but slow enough that we can keep people on board. I didn't learn this in Christian circles. It was actually in the Commerce Board world. But this principle that you can move faster alone, okay, the change you can make is faster if you're by yourself, but it's more lasting with more people. Okay? So that's the goal, is to keep people moving together, and that's an intentional effort. And I think that's a good point. And as the time kind of winds down here, I think that's a good place to land this plane. Who has seen, it's been floating around the internet now for a year or a couple of years. Who's ever seen this mindset heat map? Has anyone seen that? The heat map thing about the way different people think? It's basically like a target. Okay, so picture like a target for darts or for sighting in your gun or whatever. So it's a target that shows the difference in the way the conservative mind works versus a progressive mind. And so on this target, right at the bullseye, is you and your family. Okay, so your wife and your kids. And then is your community, and then is the greater area, and then your province or your state, and then your country, and then everyone in the whole wide world. And questioning where are your greatest moral obligations? No surprise whatsoever. Where do you think it's hottest on the conservative heat map? In the center or at the edge? At the center. And how do you think for the progressive mindset, how does the heat map work? Where is it hottest? Right at the edge. It's an inverse picture. The conservative mindset, and I'd say the biblical mindset, would say we are most morally responsible for those closest to us. Okay? I have a greater moral obligation to my own wife and my own children than to anyone else's wife or children. That's a feature, not a bug. And then I have the next most responsibility, let's say to my extended family and to this church, and I have virtually zero responsibilities for all the children of the world. Virtually none. Okay? This is just Christianity 101, the Ordo Amoris, okay? And people will use interestingly, people use the parable of the Good Samaritan both ways on this one. The progressive will say, well, see, he wasn't a family member. No, but he was the person God put right in front of me. So it's still the Ordo Amoris. Who did God put in front of me? That's who I'm responsible to. I am not responsible, okay, for someone halfway across the world in the same way that I'm responsible for my kids and then the kids that are here and so forth. And if we can apply that thinking, which I think is biblical thinking, who's your neighbor? Well, the one God put in front of you. So that's first of all your wife, your children, your church, your community. However, we can move out. It doesn't mean it's wrong to work at the edges. It just means our efforts need to be focused on where did God put you? Okay, this isn't rocket science. Where did God put you? And who are the people God put around you? Those are the people you are responsible for. Okay? And so again, if we apply this to, okay, well, we've drifted so far from a biblical conception of law. Yes, we have. But I feel zero calling to become the Prime Minister of Canada. This is where God put me. He gave me this wife, he gave me these kids, and he gave us this church. That's where I'm going to put my effort into. And however far I get, good. One day you're going to put me in a box and you're going to put me under the ground, and hopefully I did my part to move the needle a little bit, and then it's up to the next kids to do the same thing with the people around them. But we have to get away from this mindset that it all has to be perfect by Tuesday afternoon or else it's not worth doing. But we also have to get over the complacency that says, okay, well then I'm just going to resign my hands in despair. We're so far off from a biblical vision, there's no point in trying. That's also not right, okay? Faithfulness where God has you. And wherever he has you, that's where you work. Yep. No, amen. Audrey, just if you didn't hear Audrey, use Psalm 37 to basically make that point. Man your station, and then let God worry about everyone else's station. Do what you can where you are. Yep.
Well, we've used this principle in other things too, where you can't pastor a church if your own house is in complete disarray, and between your room principle or it's always the progressive left whose life is a complete dumpster fire that wants to tell everybody else this is how we would solve all the world's problems. It's like, well, that's pretty unconvincing considering you can't solve your own little circle. So if you can't take care of your own personal, who are you to tell anybody else how to do anything?
Yep. No, Howard made the point where and this is seen all over the place. People who are least capable of managing their own lives seem to be the most interested in meddling in other people's lives. It's a bizarre principle, but it's almost without fail. Okay? The kind of people who would register concern, the concerned bros about different things that you find in conservative Christian circles. I'm just really concerned about the way women would get treated in conservative Christian circles. Okay, who's the guy with 2 X's? It's not me. It's that guy, right? But it's a bizarre principle, but it just shows, again, the importance of do what God put in front of you to do. And there's also this principle, if you do well at that, he'll give you the next thing to do. And if you do well at that, he'll give you the next thing. So we just, rather than worrying about everything at once, be faithful where you are. God will give you the next thing to do. And I do believe, to bring it back here, I do believe that the Great Commission will not go unfinished. So I believe we not only can, I'm confident that we will move back into reality at some point. I think there's hopeful signs that that is happening. And as it does, we can say, and I'll leave it here, we can discuss it again next week once we're back in a warm building and all thinking clearly. You can ask, and I've had people ask this, well, this is so theoretical about how biblical law would work because we're so far from that. Why even concern ourselves with something like chapter 19, section 4? And I'd say this, a couple things. One, we always have to have the end goal in mind, even if we're far from it. Okay? Before GPS, when we had to pick a fence post at the far end of the field so you could make a straight line, that fence post is way out there, but you still are using it for direction. Okay? So we need to know where we're headed. And I'd also say this, and this is a great encouragement. If there's one thing you can learn about history, it's that it's not a straight line. Okay? Just because things are slow or far away doesn't mean God can't do things very fast. Okay? John Knox came back to a Scotland that was far worse than you can picture Canada being right now. Far worse. And by far worse, I mean far worse. And his prayer was, Lord, give me Scotland or give me death. And God gave John Knox Scotland in 40 years. It was an evangelical, reformed country. In 40 years. That's like lightning speed. Okay? So it doesn't always work in a straight line. Don't despair if it's slow. But we need to keep in mind, okay, as God gives us opportunity, where are we headed? So it is still a practical consideration, even if we're far from it. And I'd also say this, don't also take for granted how much Christian capital we still have. Lots. Last night on Hockey Night in Canada, I heard Elliot Friedman say, let's not be like Solomon and cut this baby in half. And I just thought, isn't that interesting? 100 years into this secularist swamp, a hockey commentator still knows about Solomon cutting babies in half. That's amazing. And it was one of those moments. I bet John Knox wished he had that when he got to Scotland in the 1500s, but he didn't. Okay? We've got much better field position. If God would grant revival today, we have much better field position than John Knox would have dreamed of. We have much better field position than Calvin would have ever dreamed he could get in Geneva, Switzerland. Okay? There is incredible capital still. We still have laws about murder. We still have laws about rape. Okay? There's still good things here. Thank you to the Christian worldview. Okay? So the Christian worldview is doing a lot more in our society than we sometimes think. Yes, it needs to be recovered in a lot of areas, but we need to think soberly about where we want to go and about where God calls the world to go. And we can pick that up next time. We probably all want to stand up and move and visit and warm up here a little bit. So why don't we close in prayer? We can take it from there. Father God, we want to thank you for your law, and as we think about how your law should affect not just our personal lives, but the broader society and families and even nations around us, Lord, I pray that we would be sober in what our responsibilities are, that we would take seriously the things that you have actually called us to do and not to become anxious about the things that are so far removed from us. Lord, but then I also pray that as we are faithful, that you would give us the next thing to do and then the courage to do it. And I pray that even if these things seem somewhat theoretical and abstract and far away from us at certain points, Lord, I pray that as we read your word and as we read the history of your people in the Bible and even after that time, Lord, I pray that we would be greatly encouraged, that you frequently honor faithfulness and that we would not despair at our surroundings, but that we would continue to labor faithfully and understanding that unless you build the house, our work is in vain. So I pray that we would always do it with a mindset towards godliness, towards your honor, towards your glory, and that we would persevere. Lord, I thank you again that you've given us your word to clarify the moral principles that you would have us to live by, that we are not blind, we are not in the dark, but I pray rather that we would read your word with the eyes that would see what you have called us to do and where you have called us to do it, and that we would each one here be faithful at manning whatever station you have given us. Thank you for your kindness, and I pray that you'd be with us as we prepare to fellowship here again later and give you corporate praise this morning. I pray this all in the strong name of Jesus. Amen.